Good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic to see lots of faces in the boxes, and welcome to everyone on Zoom and on YouTube. This must be I think our fourth online research forum seminar, and it's brilliant that we have so many people taking part and participating in their own way. So everyone's very welcome. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Professor John Miller, who's going to give today's research forum lecture seminar. In some ways, he doesn't need any introduction. He was head of the School of Wind, Brass and Percussion at the Royal Northern College of Music until very recently, from 2013 to 17. He's currently a tutor in trumpet, and he has a huge expertise in trumpet and in historical trumpet playing performance. He's a member of the he was a member of the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble from 1972 to 80, the Philharmonia Orchestra from 1977 to 94. He was a founder member of the Wallace Collection from 86 and again from 2014. And he came to the RNCM in 1999. And then became the head of the School of Wind, Brass and Percussion. He became a professor in 2010 and a fellow of the Royal Northern College of Music in 2006. He's, in addition to all his professional performance as an ensemble and solo player, and his career as a expert teacher, he is also very interested in research in this area. And he has an article in the Historical Brass Society Journal from 2019 on the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. He's a contract with Boydell and Brewer for a book project on the modern brass ensemble in Britain, and hopefully that will appear in the next couple of years. And today he's going to talk to us about his research on the modern brass ensemble, and he will play some of his historical instruments. And he gave us a little bit of a preview of that if you were on very early. So please, everyone, let's welcome John Miller.
Barbara, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it's lovely to see so many of you here today. It's lovely just to see a few friendly faces. The lockdown is a strange time for all of us, and sometimes I feel as if I'm here on the inside looking outwards, but seeing familiar faces is a lovely thing. Now, I think today, I want to really talk round about my subject of the modern brass ensemble, perhaps defining what it is, what's modern about it, and what's not modern about it. So really, it's an account of types of ensembles of orchestral brass instruments that were firstly played by orchestral musicians. So it's orchestral instruments, orchestral players, and they really grew from the 1950s to something that's very recognized in concert venues around the world, in schools, in conservatoires like ours, and in many branches of the media, sort of millions of CDs and recordings, etc. Now, the scope of my book, it encompasses the brass quintet. It encompasses larger ensembles, like a symphonic brass ensemble. If you think of the Fanfare for the Common Man by Copeland, there's another also, a neoclassical trio by Poulenc, there's a sextet by Carl Ruggles, and so on. So really, other than the orchestral instruments that are being played, a common factor of this is the performance practice. Now, the performance practice in general is really essentially a nuanced type of orchestral playing. Now, the repertoire for these groups has remained incredibly eclectic and includes arrangements and transcriptions that have really been considered very valuable to contemporaries. So that's really part of the story as well. Now, in 1969, there was an American recording of all things, the music of Giovanni Gabriele, and it was made by the brass players of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia, and the Cleveland Orchestras. They made all this, they made this record in one day, and that's when they had the day off. They all sort of flew in somewhere, and there was no conductor. Now, this recording of Gabriele, it received the Grammy Award for Chamber Music in 1970. It was even more popular than, if you can believe it, Arthur Rubinstein and the Guarneri Quartet, Jacqueline Dupre and Barenboim at the piano, Itzhak Perlman and Ashkenazi. Now, this is mind-boggling that a bunch of brass players could achieve something like this, or it could attract so much interest. It was a phenomenon. Now, you see, this was about the time in 1969 when the early music revival was biting in Britain. But the Americans, they made something that was highly inspirational and to many brass musicians. And it's interesting to me that many people who went on to be very strong participants in the early music revival, they were inspired by this recording. So the recording, it sort of speaks for itself. But in my work, I make a very, very clear distinction between original music for the modern brass ensemble and transcriptions of early music for the modern brass instruments. Now, I've been involved in brass chamber music all my musical life. Barbara has told you about some of these contexts, but I mean, I started playing brass band quartets when I was maybe sort of about age of about 9 or 8 or 9 or something like that. And what surprised me was that, you know, when I got into the few recent years, there was no account of this activity, really, just a few book chapters, and they're all just a little bit sparse. And you know, in contrast, there are incredibly deep and comprehensive accounts of the British brass band, and also the British music of the military, and so on. So I mean, I was thinking about that. Now, way back in 2014, I went and gave my very first conference presentation. Now, I was helped in doing this by the RNCM, but I went to New York City and I sort of gave a talk in this conference. I really enjoyed doing it. And what I did is, I mean, it'll just be a little bit like today. I took several instruments and I played the instruments with my right hand and I operated the PowerPoint with the left hand. And it was a great thing for me to do. It was just an experience, just putting something together like that. I hadn't done it before. It's strange, you know, performing on the trumpet is one thing, and performing in a conference is another. You know, now there was a very anonymous elderly man at the back of the room, and this anonymous early elderly man, he asked a few incredibly good questions, and I thought, well, who's this guy? You know, he said, I don't recognize him. I don't recognize him. I didn't know him. But I went and spoke to him afterwards, and it turned out to be somebody called Günter Schuler. Now, Günter Schuler is probably one of the key people in my whole study. You know, Günter Schuler, he wrote a sort of a symphony in 1950, and it was a watershed moment. Later that weekend, Günter Schuler gave a talk at the conference about his third stream activities. You know, the third stream is, you know, that's what he believed in. He believed in the fusion of jazz and classical music. And he asserted that this symphony for brass and percussion, which he wrote in 1950, was the most important writing for brass ensemble since Giovanni Gabriele. Well, you know, that's quite an assertion, but today I think he was correct. It was a real pivot point in composition for brass, performance for brass, and reception. It was played in one of the main seasons of the New York Philharmonic, conducted by Metropolis, and then it was recorded as part of an album. And on the album, it had some jazz as well. And the soloists, there were J.J. Johnson and Miles Davis. What an experience that was in 1957. So I was able to meet and able to discuss things with the great man Günter Schuler. Now, I returned to the RNCM and I began to sort of narrow my sights, and I became interested really in this account of the brass ensemble. And oddly, nobody had ever really done it. And this was despite brass ensembles of various types being very established by about the 1970s, even in Britain. So 2 AHRC bids later, I sort of came out of that with no funds realised. I didn't quite get the money, but what I did get, I got a lot of information, and I could see that information could be compiled into a coherent account. Now, I went back to New York in 2017 and I presented more work in progress, which was a lot more crystallized. And the outcome of that was a journal article about the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, which I'm very pleased I've been able to do that. Now, a lot of the information in that journal article came from the RNCM archives right downstairs, you know, if we were in the college now. So, and I have to thank Heather Roberts for her amazing help in that study. You know, I mean, I've had a lot of help from the college as a whole, from Barbara and the team, and from Heather. You know, it's incredible. So there was sufficient information to work up into a book, and that's been really my passion for the last 3 years. Now that's all the background on this. Now in such a book, you know, I think the next thing is what's the structure, what's the content. Now I think I've explained already what we perceive as a modern brass ensemble. It emerged after the Second World War in the USA, really. And it emerged in the USA, and it emerged in part because of the American GI Bill. Now that entitled servicemen to free college education. Now, so because of that, there were so many servicemen came back that the Juilliard School and the Cincinnati Conservatoire and so on, they became very, very oversubscribed. And the brass players, they needed something to do. So the New York Brass Ensemble that was formed by the students, it was student-led and student-run. It was incredibly productive, and it really represented a new sort of a whole new generation of brass players. They were all involved in this. All the people that went to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, and so on. They all came from this New York Brass Ensemble, and they all really had experience of Günter Schuller. And I think that really, I mean, one of the themes today is really how the American culture of brass, it came to the fore. And there were many things happened in America that came over to Britain and to other countries. You know, I mean, for example, many of you may know of the trumpeter Philip Jones in London, who formed his brass ensemble in 1951. The ensemble didn't do very much in 1951 till the 1960s. Now, in 1963, Philip Jones chaired a London concert given by the New York Brass Quintet. Now, that convinced him how far he could push his own group. Otherwise, there were extraordinary things happened in Britain as well. And I remember that there was an incredible surge of activity in higher education. It started really in the Guildhall School around 1970. And that was really the first serious interest in the modern brass ensemble being something that's quite credible. They played sort of compositions by Schuller alongside Gabrielli and the best of the brass band repertoire. That spread as well. Now, what about all the background of this book? You know, where did it all come from? Where did brass quintets come from? You know, the history of brass instruments is a little bit complex. Where did the new idioms come in? I think there are some parallels in the way that the woodwind instruments developed, but the brass instruments need to be treated a little bit differently just because of what happened in the 19th century. In the 19th century, there were massive social and economic changes, and that enabled brass instruments to be much more common. They were available, they were mass produced, they were massively effective social movements. We know about one of them in Britain. It's been quite extraordinary. And I think another big change was the advent of jazz in the 20th century. So we have really in the 19th century, we have technology and developments in instruments, and in 20th century we have developments in idioms. You know, both of these factors made brass instruments more common than ever before. And now at the end of the 19th century, it was the amateur idiom of brass playing that was dominant in Britain. Brass bands existed in almost every hamlet in the country, and things like the Salvation Army had a very strong idea because of their advertising through their brass bands. But jazz, later on, it made brass playing quite ubiquitous. You've just really got to think of Louis Armstrong. So so that's the background from which my structure emerges through all these cultural developments and social developments. And from now on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to butterfly a little, and I'm going to illustrate the spirit of my study in several demonstrations from various landmark periods. And I'll be demonstrating really techniques and cultures, and I'll be using genuine historical instruments. Now, the chromaticism of brass was arrived at really in fits and starts, and players and inventors, they attempted to achieve chromaticism long before the mechanisms were invented for the instruments. So we've all heard about stopping on the French horn, but hand stopping was used also on the natural trumpets. And I'll demonstrate this. This is played on a modern instrument, but I'm using hand stopping. So here is the modern trumpet here. I'll get it where you can see it. And so on. So such techniques, there were, you know, I mean, what I played, it was quite simple, but it demonstrates immediately you've got twice as many notes. And that was necessary. Now this, it developed rather further in the horns and the trumpets. But in the trumpets, there were mechanisms such as keys and valves that came in, and they were adopted rather more than on the horn. The horn players were a little bit more resistant about technological change. Now, the first patent for a valve was issued in 1818 to Heinrich Stotzel and Friedrich Blumel. And a little bit later than this, there was a type of valve which was associated with Stotzel, and it was in circulation in both France and Britain until about 1850. And this type of valve, the Stotzel valve, or the so-called Stotzel valve, was produced up until about the First World War. And it was a very cheap way to make instruments. And here you can see it. Here's the Stotzel valves. Now, what's so distinctive about these is that the valve casings, you know, you can see them here, 3 valve casings, that's part of the airway. So the air goes through the instrument, and the air goes down through the valves and out through the bottom. And that's probably the cheapest type of valved instrument that you could produce. Now it's quite crude in a way, you know, it's less developed. And valves that became more sophisticated as the century went on. Now I'm going to play something on this instrument. I need to get danger money for doing this, Barbara. So that's something from the Symphonie Fantastique from the first movement. Equally familiar from the same piece by Berlioz. So there we are, sort of a march to the scaffold to brighten up your afternoon. Now, during the 19th century, with all of these inventions, the designs and the scope of brass instruments experienced an extraordinary transformation that influenced the development of the orchestra, the military bands, and amateur and popular idioms. Now, the indicative instrumentations of the military bands, for example, Wilhelm Wieprecht's formations for the Russian infantry in 1838 and Adolf Sax's proposals for the French in 1845. They're really radical with lots of new instruments, and at this time the military bands became potent symbols of the influence and power of the various European states. And you know, if you think about this, the military bands, they became much more like orchestras through these newly invented instruments. And they, of course, the bands played orchestral transcriptions. So there was a place for all these instruments to go. Now, the orchestra was a little bit less keen in some cases to integrate the new inventions. Now, there's a wonderful image of Johannes Brahms. Now, Johannes Brahms, he was a horn player, and he was a founder member of the Wiener Waldhornverein. It's the society of the hunting horn players of Vienna, and he's there in amongst about maybe 50 players with a hunting horn in his hands and a very big beard, you know. And you know, this image, in a sense, it speaks volumes, because Brahms, and I think Mendelssohn as well, they loved the natural characteristics of the brass instruments. The valves, it did something, it brought enhancement, but some would say it robbed the natural instruments of their charm and their essential qualities. Now, Paris, it was at the vanguard of technical development. That's where many things happened, was in Paris, with Adolf Sax and many others making instruments. And there was a particular convergence of technology, pioneer performers and composers with overlapping interests about 1850. And there's a little repertoire of popular music and art music for brass in the mid-century. Now, Berlioz, I mentioned a little bit earlier, he was notable for his interest in the cornet and the ophicleide early in their histories. So some of the earliest manifestations of a modern brass ensemble dates from this period, and players sought to elevate brass chamber music into the realms of chamber music. So just like in the case of Brahms above, you know, with his hunting horn society, I think it was again a society. It was a Société Calco-Philharmonique. I could loosely say that's a society for the appreciation of brass music. It was a focal point, and this had some parallels just beforehand in the Reicha and the Wind Quintet. Now, later in the century, there was another convergence of serious composers and amateur and professional players. This was in St. Petersburg. Now, in St. Petersburg and the Baltic, there was an amazing amateur professional culture that overlapped in all sorts of ways. Now, the most exclusive rendezvous of these meetings were in the meetings of the octet of His Imperial Highness, the Sovereign of the Tsarevich Alexander Alexandrovich, in which the Grand Duke, he played his favorite Courtois cornet. And the society grew into a subsequent Society of Wind Music Lovers in 1872. So, and this was before Alexander rose to be Tsar Alexander III in 1881. Now, what do I have here? You get the subsequent Society of Wind Music Lovers in 1872, and the Alexander played on a Courtois cornet. Here is a Courtois cornet, and it's sort of, you know, see there's some fancy writing on the bell there. Now, this cornet, it dates from between 1872 and 1878. So here's the cornet of the exact period of the Tsar, you know, which is brilliant. And so this was made all those years ago, and I maintain it's still as good today than the day it was made. You know, things then, they were made to last. So many musicians came to St. Petersburg from France and from Germany, because in St. Petersburg there was a very vibrant economy in which they could earn money. Now, Arban, the cornet player, he was one who went there in the summer months to direct an orchestra. Another one was Oscar Bohm. Oscar Bohm, he emigrated from Germany to St. Petersburg. And I just want to play you something on the Courtois cornet. And I hope you'll be able to detect that the Courtois cornet is quite a bit more sophisticated than the Cornopian with the Stotzel valves. So the whole mechanisms of brass instruments became sophisticated, incredibly well developed, and this was really, it was 19th century high tech. I'm going to play you a little bit of the Oscar Boehm Concerto, which was written in 1899. I think it's possibly one of the last big romantic pieces for trumpet. So I'm just going to play you the start. So I'll stop there. Now you may have picked up that it's a little bit similar to something else. I'm just going to play you that little something else. Here it comes. So there you are. That's the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, of course. So Boehm, Oscar Boehm, he drew on other things to be re-expressed on the cornet. Now, I'll play you the beginning of the last movement of this little concerto, and it's sort of rather similar to something else as well. So here is what Oscar Boehm wrote in his finale, and it's a quirky little thing. So a little bit like. So you see, it's the finale is a little bit close to the Carnival of Venice. You know, it's a well-known sort of virtuoso piece. So, you know, one of the features of the cornet and brass playing is you got quite a lot of virtuosity arrived with the valves. Quite an endearing feature, I must say. And in Paris, you know, these sort of things, they attracted enormous audiences. Now, the Russian culture, you know, the Russian culture around the Tsar, it included many composers: Tchaikovsky, Balakirev, Rimsky-Korsakov. They were all involved in this, and this culture produced some other brass music. It's a little bit obscure, and it was written by a cellist, the cellist in the Belayev Quartet. He was called Victor Ewald. Now, Victor Ewald, he was really a cellist, and he wrote a considerable amount of string music. Now, his brass quintets, to me, they seem to be conceived really as if they were conceived from the cellist's chair in the string quartet. Now, he played the tuba as an amateur. So the tuba parts are really good. Jack Adler McKean, he'll know these pieces very, very well. But, you know, essentially the real chamber music, and, you know, the real chamber music in the respect that, you know, you don't really need an audience. They can be played just for sheer musicality and really enjoyment. Now, I think the Russian school is really interesting for those interested in orchestration. I mean, if you think about Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov in particular, there's Rimsky-Korsakov's one of his best students, a bloke called Igor Stravinsky. You know, there was a lot happened in Russia, and I really think that Russia, it was a big sort of melting pot where virtuoso players, amateurs, professionals, even the Tsar, they would meet and discuss brass playing. So that was a big influence. And I think that's the reason that the Russian orchestrations are so potent. You know, Rimsky-Korsakov in the late century, he was the inspector of the naval bands. And there he did a lot of research and found out a lot about all the wind instruments and wrote for them. Now, there's a big influence that's coming a little bit later. And it's in the 20th century. And really it's jazz. And an examination of what happened in jazz has been a very important part of my study. Now, I've noticed that tonight, the Students' Union, they're putting on a social event, and it's Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, and so that's very connected to what I'm sort of discussing now. Now, information on an all-black military band from New York is fascinating. It stepped ashore in France on New Year's Day in 1918, and what happened to that military band is fascinating. They played much conventional music, but they also played a little bit of jazz. Now, in August of that year, the band, it was now part of the renamed, it was the 369th Hellfighters Infant Regiment, joined the Allied conference in Paris. It was just prior to the Allies' escalation at the end of the war. Now, the band, conducted by James Rees Europe, they played all the ceremonial music at the final event of the Congress of Allied Women War Workers, etc. And they brought the house down. And they really brought the house down to such an extent that they were requisitioned to stay another 8 weeks in Paris, and they were paraded in front of some other military bands from Europe, the Grenadier Guards, the Musique de la Garde Républicaine, and so on. And they always stole the show. And really, this is accepted to be the first significant dissemination of jazz in Europe. And I really just want to illustrate some of the things that these players did in 1918, because some of these things were new. So first of all, they manipulated mutes in their performances. Not all the performances. Sometimes they played things legitimate, but sometimes they did things with mutes to alter the sound, like this. It sort of contributed to an incredible sort of excitement, Other than that, they twirled their tongues in their mouths. That's according to the reports. Twirled their tongues in their mouths. And what do you think that is? It's really what we know as flutter tonguing. So twiddling the tongue in the mouth, it's something like this. And you can combine the two things. They smeared between notes. It was very easy on the trombone, of course. Trombone's a very easy instrument. So smearing between the notes, I'll give you a little demonstration. You can do that by sort of moving the vowels very slowly. So you see, I'm making all these little inflections. There were other extemporizations. So I mean, now this band, it made about 24 recordings just when it came back to New York. So there's incredible evidence of what they played and how they played it. So they did all this. Some of their extemporation was cheeky interjections. So sometimes at the end of the movements, you get things like this. So they play all sorts of cheeky things, but you see the real advance here was the role of the performer in interpretation. In other words, rather than just playing the music, the players played with it. Now you can trace these techniques very easily into the post-war art music of the 1920s. Stravinsky's ragtime, Mio, Kurt Weill, and so on, and these brought brass into prominence. So brass playing sort of kind of came to the fore, and it kind of came to the fore because of all the characteristics therein. Some of those techniques and mutings were transferred into modern jazz and also into contemporary music. That's why in contemporary music you got all these mutings. That's where the ideas came from. It came from the Harlem Hellfighters and other black musicians. I'll just give you two little demonstrations. There's a very characteristic type of muted playing, which I'll demonstrate to you. Now, this is a Harman mute. Now, the Harman mute has had the little stem taken out. Now, that produces an incredibly interesting timbre, which I think you should hear. I think you'll recognize this. and you'll probably recognize who the performer is that I'm trying to copy. But here it comes. Miles Davis, you know, he made that sort of a particular muting very famous. There's another thing before I leave jazz. This thing is called the plunger mute, and it was really developed from something that you would unclog the sink with. It's as simple as that. And I think you can think, you know, in the trombone as well, brass instruments started to speak. You know, so sometimes that speaking, it would be created by manipulating the mutes and manipulating the types of tonguing. So you could get things like this. So that's the sort of thing that Luciano Berio was very interested in. You know, these type of manipulations and devices that could extend the language of the instruments. Now, in Britain, in the early 20th century, orchestral playing had different traditions and customs, and I want to demonstrate some of these traditions and customs to you as well. Now, I've got a trumpet here, which was made in 1903. So it's a beautiful instrument. It was made in Brussels. But this is exactly the model that was played in the London Symphony Orchestra when it was founded in 1904. So you get another aspect of the trumpet, and it's being a very pure thing that really goes way back to the Baroque. So you get a very pure language, a very pure style. And this was the sort of way that people were really taught at the conservatoires and in the military sometimes in Britain. And I'll play you something that you'll know as well. So this is in a sense, it's a very Elgarian trumpet, but I'm going to play a melody by Gustav Holst. So I'm very fortunate that I knew somebody that played one of these instruments from a guy who joined the London Symphony Orchestra in 1911 and played on this very type of trumpet. And I think, you know, it's interesting to have known a musician who actually started his career before jazz. You know, and that was his concept of sound, you know, is to make it very elegant and pure and in straight lines, with not really with any vibrato. I was overdoing it there. In Britain, I think the trumpet was less of a solo instrument than it is now. But somewhere where the trumpet really came to the fore again was really in the activities of the amateur choral societies. And I'm thinking really about the oratorios. And I've just brought out another trumpet. This is dates from the 1920s. Now this has got a different shape. You'll see this is a different shape. As the angler would say, you should have seen the one that got away. But you know, this has a distinctive sonority as well. So this type of trumpet, it became termed as the Bach trumpet. You know, I mean, it wasn't essentially the type of trumpet in Bach's time because it's got valves on it, but it's a very sort of pure sound. And I'll just let you hear this. And you know, it's a world away from the jazz world. So I'll just play you a little bit. So that'll blow the cobwebs away before I go back into the garden. So you see, during the 20th century, orchestral players and other players, they developed eventually a hybrid technique where orchestral muscle, and you've seen just a little bit of that, could be combined with other very nuanced approaches, and where chamber music could work. And really, the thing I mentioned earlier, Philip Jones and his brass ensemble, he spent the 1950s doing just that. He spent the 1950s trying to distill the brass playing into something that could be applicable in chamber music. Now, these first 5 decades of the 20th century, they fascinate me. So, for example, you get things like Charles Ives, From the Steeples and the Mountains. That was about 1905, 1906. It lay unperformed until 1953, when Bernstein premiered it with members of the New York Philharmonic. Some of these isolated compositions were highly innovative and they were unprecedented. Conversely, Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man in 1943, it soon became iconic. Now, modern brass, it adopted a further musical identity through performing transcriptions of early music. Remember, I mentioned the Americans playing Gabriele. So really, my first task in writing that book was to tease out and analyze these several divergent strands of development in modern brass ensembles and modern playing of brass instruments prior to our coalescence into a coherent entity. And 1951 is a great place to stop. That's the year that I was born, 1951. But, more to the point, that's when Philip Jones set up his brass ensemble in Britain. Now, since then, what we have seen, we've seen the arrival and we've seen the blossoming of the women brass ensemble. Think of Bones Apart Trombone Quartet. They were formed when I came to the RNCM. Also, the early music revival in the 1970s uncovered lots of music that which had really disappeared. So that really concludes this afternoon what I want to say to you. You know, I've covered a lot of ground, and I thank you for listening to this sample of my work in progress. Now, what I look forward to is I look forward to real chamber music being enabled to technology yet unknown to us today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. You can see all the virtual clapping there. You've ranged so widely, and the expertise in sort of understanding of these different historical and national traditions and techniques and developments is staggering. And thank you for performing those extracts. You really hear things in different and important ways. And certainly when your work, when you were talking about France in the early 20th century, at the end of the war, that really makes all sorts of of sense to the sort of repertoire I look at. So I'm sure we'll all have lots of different questions coming from the covering the range of the topics that you've looked at today. I suggest that people put up their hands, and I will monitor this and obviously bring people in. It's perhaps not so easy this time for people on YouTube to do that, but if anyone, if anybody on YouTube would like to ask a question, they can of course email John Miller, who's in the press. I'm not sure why that noise is happening, but if there's a way in which you can find communicate your question, we will certainly take questions from our community outside the virtual RNCM. Okay, so first up was Michelle.
Hi, John. That was absolutely fantastic, amazing, full of detail, and it's just great to hear you play and on all those incredible instruments. Thank you. I just wondered where, with all these developments of the different instruments, which as you showed look very different, sound quite different, have quite different roles, where did the drive come from for these new instruments? Because I mean, I know you covered a time span, but it seems like there were quite significant developments in instrument design in a relatively small number of years. Was that manufacturers just having the initiative and the time to experiment? Was it performers finding that they couldn't do certain things? Was it composers challenging what sounds they wanted? What drove such relatively quick and significant development in manufacturing?
Well, it's that's a really interesting question, Michelle. So it's a good question, and you could really make a comparison of this technology in the middle of the 19th century with technology in the 20th century. I'm thinking about the computer. Now the actual inventions that were used by Microsoft, they were around for a couple of decades before something happened, and suddenly people realized the possibilities of these things, and it expanded very, very quickly. Now I think that in an answer to this, I think there were two sort of really important centers, centers of activity, and that was really, it was Paris, and I think it's probably Berlin. Because some of the drivers were Wieprecht, he was the director of the Prussian military, and Sachs, he was one who put forward a proposal to market and sell his instruments, as well as being a brilliant inventor. These people were entrepreneurs. And so the manufacturing of instruments, it was actually big business. It was a sensation. And these instruments, they caught on incredibly strongly in amateur music making. Now in Britain, the people were able to have access to instruments through hire purchase schemes. The brass band movement in Britain, mostly the bands were informed how they could maybe use their employers as guarantors. And so on, so something, something about it, it sort of spread like wildfire. And sort of in the 19th century and the 20th century, you get all sorts of things that occur almost simultaneously, and they're essentially unconnected. So I've been looking at these little outbursts all over the place, and they're just not always connected.
Thank you.
I'll kind of answer your question.
David Horn, you're next.
Thanks very much, John. It was lovely to hear you talk and to hear you play. I had a question about what resources you would suggest for composers, for example, because it often strikes me that the brass section is one part of an orchestra that composers, unless they're actually brass players themselves, are frequently the most frightened of, and sometimes it's the one that they come to last. So who are the composers in the 20th century and beyond that you would say to someone, have a look at their writing, have a look at what they're doing? They really seem to understand the instruments.
That's that's a fascinating question. And I mean, I think you can. I mean, I think it's possible to find all sorts of wonderfully good practice in orchestration. And I mean, I tend to often go to Stravinsky because because I like his music so much. I like the way that he constructs things. He's very daring, but everything is really practical. But if you think of the ways in which he incorporates the piccolo trumpet or the Wagner tuba, sometimes it's incredibly unconventional. But so I don't know quite how to answer that. I mean, I think there are other composers who are possibly more practical and more safe. But I think I'd have to think about that one, David.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you.
Jack Adler-Mickey.
Thanks, Barbara. Thank you, John, for a fantastic presentation. As you can imagine, I have a million things to ask, but I'll try and limit it for now. I suppose my main question is about this brass ensemble evolution that you've been talking about. And what strikes me as particularly interesting in the brass ensemble is that there are these core works, but then there's very long gaps. So often seen as, you can correct me, but one of the most earliest romantic brass pieces, chamber music pieces, being the Cherubini quintet or sextet, can't remember exactly what it is, written in about 1815.
Yeah.
And then, with very few exceptions, there's nothing really until the Ewald quartets in the 1880s. There's a couple of French pieces in between that I know, but my point is there's no composers who we've heard of today, let's say, in common parlance, in this gap. And then similarly, Gunther Schuller's Symphony 1950 is a masterwork, absolutely. But in the 70 years since, composers have certainly experimented with the brass ensemble, Xenakis, Chelsea, Carter, Dylan, Max Davies, but none of them have really created repertoire works like that. So I'm just interested if your research has uncovered any reasons behind this. Is it circumstantial, or is it just lack of awareness, do you think?
I mean, I don't think there's anything that's sort of circumstantial. I've uncovered lots of things, lots and lots of things, and I found there are certain places where there's a bit of a thread of development. Now, one of them is certainly in amongst the composers' societies. What's the one in New York? Is it the International Composers, the one that Varese was involved in? And
yeah, I can't remember the name myself either.
And these things, that they were really quite global. For instance, there was a contemporary music festival in Venice in 1922. Janacek was there, Ruggles was there. Janacek had a good time. Ruggles, they whistled them off the stage. So there are lots of threads. There are lots of threads, and some of the threads are the curiosity and the experimentation of the composers. That's one thing for sure. And there are other genres. I mean, for example, the amateur brass band movement. I mean, it's quite a massive thing. And there are other things here and there that are just at the side of it. So everything sort of everything connects to one another. But I couldn't have sustained a very interesting study of any type. Basing it purely on brass ensemble music, because I think it probably existed in a very coherent way from about maybe the 1950, 1960 probably, but before then there were other manifestations that led to it.
Yeah, just one very quick. Sorry, John.
No, I'd say I'd just put it that way.
Okay, I just as a very quick follow-up question, in the time since Gunther Schuller's symphony from 1950, as you personally have been involved in the premiere of so many masterpieces of brass ensemble music since then, are there any that you personally could point out that you think either now or might be seen in the future as milestones of the repertoire?
I think there are, but what's very interesting about this, or I think it is interesting, is that the Gunther Schuller Symphony, it was performed in New York in the 1950s and recorded there, and I mean there were other performances as well, but it was never really performed in the UK. It wasn't performed in the UK till 1972, at which point there was a BBC recording and a commercial recording, and it was never put on. But, for example, Philip Jones, he never performed it in public because he couldn't afford, he thought the audience would be too small. So he never played that piece. And that seems to be, that's unusual. And a lot of the lead was in the conservatoire sector. The conservatoire sector was able to put on that piece. Since then, I think there've been, I would say there could be intellectual highlights like Elliot Carter in the 1970s, Maxwell Davis, his quintet in 1981, and I think that brass music has limitations. Definitely, if you think about somebody like Hindemith, he wrote two concert musics. I think it was 1938. One is for brass and two harps and pianos, and the other one is for brass and strings. He didn't really see it that brass on its own could be a viable entity. And other people, if you look at other composers, I'm just thinking like Willem van Otterloo, he added on a harp, a celeste, and a piano because he thought the brass on its own was too dull. Janacek wrote a Capriccio in 1926 that has a flute. I mean, it's a piano concerto, but really it has a flute and it has 5 brass, 6 brass. So on its own, I don't think it'll probably develop any further, but I think there are quite a lot of offshoots from it.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. I think Jeff is next to ask a question.
Hi, John. That was really, really interesting. I always think it's great when these old instruments can be brought back to life and played rather than just being stuck in museums. My question is, as an orchestral instrument, when did the F trumpet start to give way to the B flat and C trumpets?
That's brilliant. Now look at the in Britain, on the continent, the valved trumpet it sort of took hold to a large extent. So on the continent, in Germany and in France as well, to an extent, there were valved trumpets in F and G. They were very long. I've got one here, but it's tough to get out of the cupboard and so on. But that had a more lasting existence in Europe. In England, the orchestras, the orchestral players, the best orchestral players were very resistant to that. And the orchestral players in the 19th century, they really played on something called the English slide trumpet. Now, the English slide trumpet was an instrument in F. So it was like a Baroque trumpet in F, but it had a little slide here that you could extend towards your head. Now, it could come down about a tone and a half. And with that, you could correct the deficient harmonics and play in tune. Now, that F trumpet, it could be crooked in different keys as well. So that was the standard instrument in England. It's bonkers, but the players they like the purity of the sound. Now that instrument. It was superseded in Britain in the last decade of the 19th century, and the valve trumpet, the valved F trumpet, it came in for probably about 15 years. It was superseded in probably the very early 20th century by this one that I played on earlier. So it had a short existence in Britain.
And is there a problem now trying to play those F trumpet parts on modern trumpets?
No, you can mostly play the notes, because the F trumpet, although the harmonic, because it's longer, the notes in the harmonic series were closer together at the top, which made it very dangerous to play, but you could play as high. And the players on those instruments, an example is a guy called Walter Morrow. he was at his peak, and maybe in about 1885, towards the end of the century and into the 20th century. I think he must have been a virtuoso. So Walter Morrow passed on to a guy called John Solomon from Liverpool. So John Solomon was one of the people who introduced the modern B-flat trumpet.
Great, thanks.
While other people think of questions they might want to ask and put their blue hands up on the participants thing on Zoom, I'm intrigued by, well, we've been trying to work out which international society and you were talking about, and I guess it's not the International Society for Contemporary Music, because that was started in Salzburg as a post First World War initiative to bring different sort of countries together as a sort of peacemaking effort. But I guess it's not that one, although Stravinsky was very prominent on that.
What was a society that was founded by Henry Cowell? Because I mean, I can go and look this up.
All right, okay. I mean, you're fascinating to hear you talk about that brass was often and is often regarded as not being sufficient on its own, that it's often in combination. And when you were talking about Stravinsky and Poulenc and some of those composers of Weill as well, often they're combining wind and brass, woodwind and brass together, and experimenting in some ways, excluding the strings to create new sorts of ensembles. I find that really interesting in the sort of sound world of the post-war period, and the sort of fashion that there was for for brass, but also for wind sonorities.
Well, this really feeds into what I really think. I think that in the 1920s, Stravinsky and others, they began to treat the woodwind instruments and the brass instruments almost in the same way. And I mean, if you consider a work like the Stravinsky Octet that has 2 trumpets, 2 horns, and 2 bassoons, a flute, and a clarinet, I think. You know, I mean, the parts all have an equal engagement, and that really fascinates me. And I think there are other pieces in this same period that do that. You know, and that doesn't seem to have happened previously, even though in the orchestra, people like Gustav Mahler and to a smaller extent Strauss, they treat the brass instruments as solo instruments as well. So you get real pianissimos.
There's a lot of French repertoire that partakes in that fascination for those sorts of combinations. Really, really interesting. While I'm still waiting for some more hands to go up, your book is going to be on British traditions. And yet you talk a lot about the particular sound worlds of the French and of the Russian, because of the sorts of instruments that were being performed. Is that the sound of the British tradition? Is that something that you are able to make a particular case for?
I think as this project has evolved, I think it's become less British, and I think it's widened a bit, and quite a portion of the book tends to be Anglo-American. But for example, at the end of the Second World War, there was an incredible repertoire of French brass music by Jolivet and Tomasi and others. You know, Paul Dukas, even in 1912, he wrote a pretty little fanfare that was played in his poem balletique. I think it was La Péri. So there's a fanfare for La Péri. And the French composers, they seem to have an interest in doing this.
Absolutely. Somebody suggested, I think it's Jeff, the New Music Society from 1925. Is that the one you were thinking of?
It is.
Well done, Jeff. So any other who wants to ask the next question? Oh, I've got a hand. Michelle.
Hello, sorry, me again. I hope you don't mind one more. it's not my expertise at all, so I might be, tell me if this is a daft question, John, and Alex as well. Alex Webb might be able to correct me on this. But you talked about links and influences from the orchestral end of things and jazz, and the differences in perhaps how brass bands might have developed. But what was the influence of the brass ensemble on the wind band, do you think? I mean, I know you said you stopped at 1951 and a lot of the development with wind bands might have come after that, but how does this all tie into the identity of the brass ensemble within the wind band?
That's a very, very good connection for me. I mean, I think around the same time, in 1951 or something, Frederick Fennell, he formed the Eastman Wind Ensemble. And maybe it was just a little bit later. And that is it's an incredibly interesting organization. And really programs are much more flexible. So if you compare it to the British military band, it was really rather refreshed in the 1920s by one of its directors. I think he was called J.A.C. Somerville. And he commissioned all the pieces like the sort of Holst Second Suite and so on. So there's enormous injection of ideas from outside the military in the 1920s. Now the same thing happened to the brass band world, because they had an injection of a new repertoire, including pieces later by Holst and even Elgar in the 1930s. So these amateur traditions, they were refreshed from outside. But the American thing in Eastman, it was quite phenomenal, and that was carried on really very, very strongly in the RNCM by Timothy Renish. So there's a big thread of a very serious approach to wind and brass music. Now that serious thread, it goes back in France very much further. That goes back to the Musique de la Garde Républicaine. Now that was always a very serious ensemble, and there are pieces by is it Dionysique? Who's the composer? I've lost it. I've lost the thread here. But I think there was a seriousness of purpose in France, and that seriousness of purpose, it also extended to brass ensemble music. In 1951, Eugene Botza, who he's written a lot of wind music. He wrote just rather sparkly but really good brass quintet. That work of I think it was 1951 as well. It was never really played in Britain until about the 1970s, because nobody could play the tuba part.
Thank you. It was wonderful to hear you bring Tim Renish and the RNCM into that discussion, and it's the range of this study is really phenomenal. Jack has mentioned Hindemith's concert music for brass, harps, and piano, Opus 49. So I don't know if Jack wants to say something about that work.
Oh no, I was just mentioning it because John mentioned it earlier. As a combination of brass and other instruments. It functions mainly as a concerto for piano, in fact. But
for example, that work, it was a commission. It was Hindemith's first American commission from Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, and so that happened. It was immediately followed within months by a commission from Kusevitsky Foundation in Boston. It's just that these Americans, you see, they're very competitive amongst themselves, and I think they thought, well, if Chicago can do this, Boston is going to do something even bigger and better. And so the dynamic in the United States is quite interesting, because you get this incredible competitiveness.
That's Sprague Coolidge was such an important patron of the arts, and a really crucial figure. And Kusevitsky, because he travelled throughout Europe and then to America, there's obviously hugely influential in commissioning new work. So do we have any further thoughts? Anna wants to come in. Great, Anna.
Thanks. Hi, John. That was excellent. One comment. Well, two questions in a way. Am I right in remembering that there's an English slide trumpet in the college instrument collection?
Yes, there is. and I never managed to get it going. I mean, I think it was made. Would it be in somewhere called Otley?
Could be.
I think Jeff would know that, because I mean I've seen the instrument and I've had a go at it, but I'll maybe have to have another go to see if I can get it working.
Yes, yes, there is.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Of course.
I've never seen it outside the case.
No, I feel it's one of those that's a bit past it, really. And then the question was the one you played quite near the end with the very long tubing. Does that have a specific name, that instrument?
It's got a specific name, but it's, I mean, I wouldn't say it's. I mean, you couldn't say it's a misnomer, because that's what it was called. But in 1885. There was a very eminent German trumpet player called Julius Koselleck. Koselleck, he was a fantastically influential figure. You know, he went everywhere, and he's quite an incredible guy. Now, he came to play in a performance of the Bach B minor Mass, because nobody had ever attempted the trumpet parts, and he played the first trumpet part, and he played on a trumpet that's even longer than this one. This trumpet is pitched in D, and he played on one that's pitched in A, and somehow or other this name of the Bach trumpet stuck. And really, in my teenage years, people. I mean, I still played this thing. I would go and do the Handel's Messiah on this, and I think the instrument, it was far bigger than I was. It was quite a spectacle, and I could see that playing this thing, it was brilliant with the audiences. Now, there was a former trumpeter in Manchester called Maurice Murphy. Maurice Murphy was a famous guy. He taught at the RNCM, of course, but he had virtually no musical education. He went straight from the Black Dyke Band into the BBC Northern Orchestra, and straight from there to the LSO, and recorded Star Wars and all that. Now, he used to go around at the weekends playing Handel Messiahs, and the choral societies, they used to adjust the starting times so they could have him there. So you'd get two Messiahs in an evening, and Maurice Murphy would go from one to another. So he probably got 20 guineas or something, you know, but what a character.
I think Jeff has just pointed out that this instrument would be perfect for social distancing. In fact, if the other one you describe, it might be even better, but maybe it's something we need to bring back much more as a mainstream instrument at the RNCM. Who knows?
We'll make it compulsory at the RNCM.
Yeah,
you have to play the long D trumpet. That's great.
Is it right? It's also called the Aida trumpet, according to Jack. Is that right?
That's very close. The Aida trumpets are in A flat and B. And Verdi, you know, Adolf Sachs, of course, he made Aida trumpets. But Verdi, he said about the Sax's trumpets, he said, oh, these things that Sachs are doing, they're okay for modern stuff. But they're no good for Aida, they're no good for ancient Egyptians. So Verdi had a set of Aida trumpets made in Milan by Pelletti, another manufacturer. So, you know, at this time, you know, all the manufacturers were out at one another. It was cutthroat competition, just like today.
Thank you, thanks for that. Learning so much today. Alex, you want to ask a question?
Hi, John. Thanks for such an interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I had a quick question about where you thought the kind of more about where you thought the kind of future of the ensemble was, and the repertoire to do with it. And I'm just kind of aware as well that a lot of the repertoire, you know, and the main repertoire being written for brass instruments and collector brass instruments is I think, perhaps it's fair or unfair to say, is firmly in the sort of brass band domain. Particularly the amount of music that gets commissioned for the major competitions, and I just wondered whether you saw that as the kind of real future of it all, or whether it was in a different direction. Or
Alex, that's great. So in the past year, I still play in a brass quintet, and in the past year we've recorded one new work by a composer called Francesco Coll. And that's an incredible piece for me. You know, I mean, he plays the trombone, Francisco, and so he understands all the brass thing. So it's very, very well scored, but it's really demanding, and that had me practicing very, very hard for a couple of months to be able to get through the part. So you know that's. I think there are not many pieces. You know, I think there are landmark pieces, in my opinion, in the brass ensembles, and I think it's worth spelling out what these are. But I mean, I think there are some pieces I wouldn't really want to play quite as much. It all evolves. Now, when I was a teenager, there was a piece by John McCabe. Now, the piece by John McCabe, that was contemporary music. So you know, today it wouldn't be considered contemporary music. And I mean, I was playing that sort of repertoire, and I was playing the Malcolm Arnold Quintet in about 1970, and that was written in 1962 or 1961. So it was relatively new. So I think there are always new things coming, but what will happen next, I don't really know. You know, I mean, not so long ago in the RNCM, there were 4 students came to me and they said, "Can we register as a chamber group?" And I said, "You must be joking," because one of them played the cornet, one of them played the tenor horn, one of them played the baritone horn, and one of them played the euphonium. I said, "You must be joking. There's no repertoire." And they said, "Oh, we'll write our own." That was a group called A4 Brass. And at the end of that year, they won the chamber music competition for the whole college. So I had to eat my hat, you see. So you don't know, you know, as well as that, you know, I think you can probably tell that I'm quite interested in the past, and in some ways, the future is the past for me. You know, playing those historic things. I find that playing the historic instruments, you get a feel for the context in which they were written, and you get a feel for the novelty of the music at that time. You can't really play these things on modern instruments, and the same is true for the Russian music. It wasn't written for modern bazookas.
That's great, thank you.
Jack, you've got a question.
Yeah, sorry, just one more quick question. Actually links directly onto what you just said about the brass band quartet, because there are these ensembles that have existed over the years of smaller brass band instrument ensembles. I'm thinking particularly the Finnish tradition of the brass band septet of sax horns, and there was the French, even Ewald's original instrumentation was for sax horns. Has there been any, I mean, obviously Ewald's music is now played on brass, modern non-saxhorn style instruments, on modern brass instruments. Has there been much crossover that you found of these things, or is it really a brass band specific tradition, this music?
Well, these pieces, they sometimes get slightly reinvented, and the Russian pieces, the Ewald quintets, they were discovered really. No, the Ewald quintet, it was published in 1911 in Leipzig. And so therefore that piece, it was known about, and it was played really throughout the world, and people thought that, well, this is the first brass quintet. Now you're right, it was written for the conical bowed instruments, and I would maintain that piece sounds better on the conical bowed instruments. That's exactly the same for the Finnish septets. You know, we know what the instruments were, and they all sound very similar. They all sound softer. So when the Ewald Quintet went to America, one of the first, in fact, the first specialist brass publisher was a chap in Massachusetts called Robert King. Robert King, he thought, this will do fine for a brass choir. So he had about 6 people on every part. So you'd have 12 trumpets and 6 tubas, and he wrote in an extra part for the euphonium as well. So he made it into a 6-part piece. So these pieces, they sometimes get translated into an idiom very, very different to what the composer envisaged. That's for sure, you know. And really, the thing that you're talking about in Britain, the small ensembles, those things, they existed from certainly the latter half of the 19th century, certainly from 1880 and 1890. You can find out a lot of information on these things from the Brass Band Press. and they've got everything in Salford University down the road. And it's quite interesting, but there was no repertoire of any originality, and probably till about 1960s.
Right. Thank
in
you.
the 1960s, there are some interesting things, but they're a bit thin.
Thanks.
John, I think that is the end of our questions, and I just want to say that we've all learnt a lot of things today, and I'm sure we've all learned different things as well, because the range of your expertise is just incredible. And it's wonderful that you are able to bring your massive expertise as a performer to bear into this this book project. I hope there will be opportunities with the book project and the publisher to have perhaps linked to recordings that you have made or that you might make, because somehow separating the two wouldn't feel quite right in your case. And this lecture today, you've managed to grab your instruments from your living room to illustrate in really, really useful ways, because I think we can separate these two worlds of research and of the sound of the music we're writing about too much, and if there is a way to bring it together, that would be fabulous. So can't wait till the book is out. We will have a big book launch at the RNCM. It's a date to put in your diary, and we'll let you know when that is. But John, if anybody on YouTube wants to send out a question to John, his email address is john.miller@rncm.ac.uk, and I'm sure John will be delighted to field those, answer the questions. Next week we have Mark Heron is going to talk about his Conduct It project, and it's a very important project that he's been involved in, international funded project, and so we're really delighted to welcome him to talk about this. So please do join us again. It's great to see you all. And finally, thank you, John, so much for a really stimulating afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.